My name is Emily. While I wouldn't describe my life as perfect, I was always thankful for it, knowing things could always be worse. I've been married to my husband, Michael, for 7 years. Most of our time together was great, especially in the beginning. But as the years went by, I noticed Michael's growing focus on his career, leaving little room for us. He stopped engaging with me or even asking how I was feeling. Despite that, I tried everything to salvage our marriage. Michael had a son from his previous marriage, Jason, and he was the complete opposite of his father. When I first met him, Jason seemed distant, but over time, we grew closer. He was always there to listen and make an effort to understand me, something I had been longing for. Then, everything shifted one day. Michael left for a 3-day business trip, and I expected to be alone. But unexpectedly, Jason knocked on my door. He was back home for a short break from college and wanted to spend time with his dad. When he realized Michael was away, he said, "Well, let's hang out," and came inside. We decided to cook dinner together. The evening started out normal in the kitchen, but soon, I noticed Jason was watching me intently. Initially, I thought it was just me overthinking, but soon enough, I couldn't ignore the way he was looking at me. That night, Jason and I had a deep conversation. Usually, he spoke about his goals and dreams, but that night, he shared something far more personal: how distant his father had been toward him. I suddenly understood that I wasn't the only one feeling lonely in this house. That realization made us closer. But at the same time, I understood the fragile line between what was right and wrong. I knew I needed to stop whatever was happening. But my emotions only grew more confused. Jason stayed up late that night, and we ended up watching a movie. I couldn't focus on the film, though, because my mind was somewhere else. I could feel Jason's gaze on me, and although it was uncomfortable, it also piqued my curiosity. After the movie, we started talking. Talking to Jason felt different from any conversation I had with Michael. He listened intently, something I hadn't experienced in a long time. I felt understood, something I deeply missed. As the night wore on, I eventually told Jason it was getting late, and he should head to bed. He looked at me with a soft expression and said, "Talking to you is so nice. Can I stay a little longer?" His words made the confusion inside me grow even more. I agreed, and we sat together in silence for a moment. Then Jason spoke again, his voice gentle. "You know, I realize how much I need someone like you to talk to." His words touched me. I smiled and said, "It's nice to hear that. I'm happy you're here." But I didn't realize how my words might have affected him. Jason looked into my eyes and took my hand. "Maybe this isn't right, but I think you're really special," he said. I was speechless. For a moment, I wanted to pull away, but I couldn't. It felt as though my loneliness and his were connecting us. But I knew I had to stop this. I gently pulled my hand back and said, "Jason, that took me by surprise. I think sometimes we misread signals," I added. But even as I said that, a heavy feeling settled in my chest. Jason replied, "You're right. Maybe I crossed a line. But please don't misunderstand me. I respect you a lot." He stood up quickly, saying, "Good night, Emily," and left for his room. I couldn't sleep that night, burdened by the emotions I felt for Jason. The next morning, things seemed normal at breakfast. Jason acted like nothing had happened, but inside, I was struggling to keep my emotions in check. We kept our distance that day, but deep down, I knew things weren't the same. When Michael returned, everything seemed to return to normal on the surface, but I knew something inside me had shifted. That brief moment with Jason haunted me. As months passed, Jason went back to college, and things seemed to settle down. But the confusion inside me didn't disappear. I continued thinking about that night and the strange feelings I had. Meanwhile, Michael continued to be cold and distant, coming home late and only speaking in shallow exchanges. It felt like we were just two strangers in the same house. When Jason returned for the holiday break, I felt both excited and ashamed of my feelings. I tried to keep a distance, but I couldn't shake the connection I felt with him. One evening, when Michael was out late again, Jason and I found ourselves alone. We had dinner, and then he asked if I wanted to go outside for some fresh air. We sat on the porch swing, the cool air and the bright stars creating an oddly calm atmosphere. After a while, Jason spoke again, his voice soft. "Being with you always makes me feel good. You know that, right?" My heart raced, and I didn't know how to respond. "I know," I managed to say. He continued, "My relationship with my dad has never been strong. But with you, it's different. You make me feel more than just family. Talking to you, being close to you, gives me strength." His words both warmed and terrified me. A voice in my head was telling me this was wrong, but I couldn't deny the way his words affected me. Then he turned to me, his eyes full of sincerity. "I can't hide how I feel about you anymore. It might not be right, but I can't stop myself." His words trapped me. I stood up quickly, trying to regain control. "Jason, what you're saying puts me in a difficult position. I'm your stepmother. You know this isn't right," I said, my voice shaking. But even as I said the words, my heart felt conflicted. Jason nodded, understanding. "You're right, Emily. But I can't suppress my feelings. I just wanted you to know how I feel." He stepped back, and that night, everything felt more complicated than ever. Jason pulled away, but neither of us could forget what had passed between us. The next morning, when Michael had gone to work, Jason came and sat beside me at breakfast. "I don't want to make things harder for you," he said, "but these feelings are real. When I think of you, I feel happy." I didn't know where this was headed, but I couldn't deny that part of me didn't want it to end. One day, Michael came home early. Jason and I were in the kitchen, sharing a coffee, when Michael caught us. His eyes lingered on us for a moment before he asked, his voice suspicious, "What are you two talking about?" Jason quickly brushed it off, but Michael's look left me feeling uneasy. Later that night, Michael asked me a question he hadn't in a long time. "Do you love me, Emily?" His voice sounded different, almost as if he suspected something. I hesitated but answered, "Of course I do," though I wasn't sure how convincing I sounded. The tension between Michael, Jason, and me kept growing. Jason kept finding ways to express his feelings, and Michael's suspicion only deepened. Things came to a head one weekend when Michael went out of town for a work meeting. The thought of being alone with Jason stirred all the feelings I had been trying to avoid. When Michael left, Jason came to me, saying, "We can't ignore this anymore. You know your dad doesn't deserve you. He leaves you alone, doesn't listen to you, but I do. I'll always be here for you." I couldn't find the words to respond. In that moment, I realized how confused and torn I was. But then, the sound of a car engine outside interrupted everything. It was Michael, back earlier than expected. Jason quickly retreated to his room, and Michael came inside, his gaze sharp as he looked around. "Are you okay?" he asked, though his tone was laden with suspicion. That night, the tension in the house was palpable. It was clear that something was amiss, and neither Jason nor I could pretend otherwise. Eventually, the situation spiraled out of control. Michael's suspicions grew, and Jason's feelings for me became even harder to ignore. One evening, during a tense dinner, Michael finally confronted us. "Emily, I feel like something's off," he said. "What's going on?" The tension was unbearable, and Jason, unable to hold back any longer, stood up and said, "Maybe you should notice what's been happening. Emily has always been there for you, but you've never really seen her." Michael, now fully aware of what was happening, lost control. The argument escalated quickly, with Jason accusing Michael of neglecting me. Michael, heartbroken and furious, demanded Jason leave the house immediately. "From now on, you have no place here," Michael said, his voice trembling with anger. Jason, without a word, packed his things and left. In that moment, everything shattered. The loss of both Jason and Michael left me feeling empty and broken. With Jason gone, the house was eerily quiet, but my turmoil was far from over. As the weeks passed, Michael and I drifted apart even further. Despite his attempts to mend things, the trust was gone, and our relationship crumbled. Eventually, I made the decision to file for divorce. When I told Michael, he looked as though he had been expecting it. He accepted it quietly, and soon, our marriage ended. After the divorce, I spent a long time healing. I never saw Jason again, but I heard he was doing well. As I tried to rebuild my life, I realized that everything I had experienced taught me a painful but valuable lesson. Sometimes, following our emotions can lead to consequences that are difficult to undo. Now, looking back, I understand the weight of my mistakes, but those mistakes are what have shaped me into who I am today. I've managed to move on from that dark chapter, and I'm at peace, knowing it's all behind me. For now, I'll end the story here. But the second part of this journey is filled with even more personal and exciting moments. If you're curious to know what happens next, please subscribe. I'm sure you'll want to hear more.